Chapter 5. The distinction, identity politics in Israel. The State of Israel will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants irrespective of religion, race or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education and culture. The Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel, 1948. A candidate's list shall not participate in elections to the Knesset if its objects or actions, expressly or by implication, include one of the following. 1. Negation of the existence of the State of Israel as the state of the Jewish people. 2. Negation of the democratic character of the state. 3. Incitement to racism. Basic Law, the Knesset, Clause 7a, 1985. Before the great secularization in Europe, Jewish believers clung to the religious axiom that sustained them through times of trouble: they were the chosen people, God's sacred congregation, destined to illuminate the nations. In reality, they knew that as minority groups existing in the shadow of other religions, they were subordinated to the stronger powers. The passion for proselytizing that had characterized these communities in the past had all but disappeared through the ages, largely from fear of the dominant religions. Over the centuries, thick layers of distrust and fear of propagating their faith padded the self-identification of the believers and bolstered the communal isolation that eventually became their distinguishing mark. In the Middle Ages, the exclusive belief in the unique nation that dwells apart also served to prevent large-scale desertion to the other monotheistic religions. Like other minorities in periods of stress and hardship, the Jewish faith communities were knit together by group solidarity. In peaceful times, the rabbinical elites exchanged information about precepts and religious norms, and various aspects of their rites and ceremonies. For all the great differences between Marrakesh and Kiev, Sana'a and London, differences not only in the secular sphere but even in the religious practices, there was always a common core of rabbinical attachment to the Talmudic law, a shared concept of deliverance from exile, and a profound religious devotion to the holy city Jerusalem, whence salvation would come. The spread of secularization in Europe eroded the status of the religious frameworks and undermined the authority of the rabbis, their communities' traditional intellectuals. Like members of other religious, cultural and linguistic groups, those who discarded their Jewish religion were swept up in the momentum of modernization. The depiction in Zionist theoretical and historical writings notwithstanding, they were not the only ones struggling to assimilate into the national cultures that were rising at this time. Perhaps peasants in Saxony, Protestant shopkeepers in France and Welsh labourers in Britain were affected differently by the rapid changes in ways of life and the migratory upheavals, but they suffered no less than did the Jewish believers. Entire worlds disappeared, and assimilation into the general economic, political, linguistic and supracultural systems demanded a painful renunciation of long-standing customs and mores. Despite the particular difficulties experienced by the Jews, in some countries, France, the Netherlands, Britain, Germany, most of them became Israelites, meaning Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Britons or Germans of the Mosaic faith. They became eager supporters of the new states. Some even stressed their national identity and took great pride in it. Rightly so, as they were among the pioneer speakers of the national languages and consolidators of the national cultures, largely because of their concentration in the cities. They were thus among the first Britons, Frenchmen and Germans. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the poet Heinrich Heine was a German before Adolf Hitler's grandfather became one, if indeed he ever did. During the First World War, which witnessed the peak of mass nationalism in Europe, they set out to defend these new homelands, and probably also killed, without notable qualms, Jewish soldiers fighting on the other side of the front line. German Jewish reformists, French Jewish socialists and British Jewish liberals almost all volunteered to defend their newfound collective property, the national state, and its territory. Strangely enough, Zionists also became involved in the war culture that focused on Europe's national boundaries, despite their belief in a separate national entity. At that time they were still too weak to offer an alternative identity that could diffuse the fighting spirit arising from the varied nationalist attachments of their supporters and activists. In fact, from 1897, the year of the First Zionist Congress, until the end of the First World War, Zionism was a feeble and insignificant movement in the world's Jewish communities, and often yielded to the national demands of the Gentiles. In Germany in 1914, Zionists accounted for less than 2% of Germans of Jewish origin, and in France even less. The Zionist idea was born in the second half of the 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe, in the lands between Vienna and Odessa. It grew uneasily on the fringes of German nationalism, and reached the lively cultural marketplaces of the Yiddish population. In fact, for all its marginality, Zionism was part of the last wave of nationalist awakening in Europe, and coincided with the rise of other identity-shaping ideologies on the continent. It can be viewed as an attempt at collective assimilation into modernity, exactly like the surrounding national enterprises that were then starting to take shape. While a significant number of its ideological progenitors belonged more or less to the Germanic culture, Moses Hess, Theodor Herzl, Max Nordau, those who developed, disseminated and implemented its theories came from the intelligentsia of the widespread Yiddish-speaking population, which was densely packed into the cities and towns of Poland, the Ukraine, Lithuania, Russia, and Romania. As noted in the second chapter, in these regions there was a secular, modern Yiddishist civilization such as did not exist in Jewish communities elsewhere, neither in London nor in Marrakesh. It was this distinctive culture, rather than religion, that incubated the proto-nationalist and nationalist ferment. It was from this semi-autonomous world that young intellectuals arose. Finding their paths blocked to the centers of high culture, academic careers, free professions, civil service, many became socialist revolutionaries and democratic innovators, and a few became Zionists. At the same time, the distinctive presence of the Yiddish communities fueled a revival of anti-Jewish feeling. The mosaic of nationalities emerging in Eastern Europe sought to eject the conspicuously different Yiddishist entity from its midst. Aside from the repression and traditional restrictions in the Tsarist regime and the Romanian kingdom, in the 1880s a wave of popular pogroms, with emergent nationalist features, shocked millions of Jews and accelerated their mass migration westward. Between 1880 and 1914 some 2.5 million Yiddish-speaking Jews transited through Germany toward receptive countries in the West. Some of them ended up on the safe shores of the American continent, less than 3% of them chose to migrate to Ottoman-ruled Palestine, and few of them stayed there. One of the byproducts of this large population shift was that it indirectly exacerbated the traditional hostility that simmered beneath the surface in Germany, scene of the transit. This fierce hatred, much of which is still left unexplained, would play out in one of the most horrendous acts of genocide in the 20th century. In the process, it showed that there is no direct correlation between technological progress or cultural refinement and morality. Modern anti-Semitism flourished throughout the world of European modernity, but its manifestation in Western and Southern Europe, as well as on the American continent, was quite different from its features and expressions in Central and Eastern Europe. The uncertainties and inner struggles of the young national identity created anxiety and fear almost everywhere. The cultural problems involved in the construction of nationalities were precisely those that turned the long-standing dislike of the unlike into an integral part of the new democratic mass politics. Any form of difference, different skin pigmentation, distinctive dialects or unfamiliar religious customs, irritated the bearers of the new national consciousness who were struggling to define and demarcate themselves as unambiguous collectivities. The level of abstraction in constructing the imagery of the nation demanded a definitive and unequivocal characterization of those who would not be a part of it. The nation, therefore, was imagined as an ancient, extended blood family, and it was convenient that its nearest neighbor would also be its most threatening enemy. Since for hundreds of years Christian civilization had depicted the Jewish believer as the ultimate other, it was a simple matter for the new collective identities to pick this element out of the old tradition and install it as the border post that marked the new national community. In territories where civil and political nationalism prevailed, it was possible to enclose and seal off the ancient hatreds that were part of the Christian heritage and to include the ostracized Jew in the new identity. The US Constitution, the French Revolution, the laws of Great Britain were sufficiently amenable, forming a stable foundation for the development of inclusive tendencies, which through gradual struggle achieved a hegemonic position in the public arena. In these and other countries, Jews became integral parts of the nation. However, this successful process was not free from turmoil and regression. The highly dramatic Dreyfus affair in France in 1894 was a good historical example of the non-linear, uncertain evolution of modern nationalism. The outburst of intense anti-Semitism that extruded Dreyfus from the body of the Gallo-Catholic nation exposed the tensions between conflicting sensibilities. Did the Jewish officer belong to the French nation, or was he a representative of an alien people who had insinuated itself from the East? To preserve its greatness, should France not be fundamentally Christian? Might not the Italian origin of Émile Zola account for his anti-patriotic support for the traitorous Jewish captain? These and similar questions roiled the national imaginary, and set off vibrations that shook the country to its foundations. The tide of anti-Semitism was ultimately turned by the political and intellectual circles that understood the value of the civil sphere, and the persecuted army officer was reattached to the French nation. Supporters of the ethno-religious national identity did not disappear, they arose again during the Nazi occupation, and some persist to this day. But culturally inclusive nationalism was invigorated after the Dreyfus affair, and despite the horrific relapse during the Second World War, it continued to entrench itself through the 20th century. Similar, though not identical, transitions occurred in a less dramatic and more nuanced way in the United States, during the McCarthy period, for instance, in Great Britain, and in most of the nation-states on both sides of the Atlantic. Anti-Semitism, like other forms of racism, did not become extinct in these countries, but it ceased to be a meaningful signifier in the trends that directed the continued development of the collective super-identity. On the other hand, as noted in the first chapter, ethnobiological and ethno-religious ideologies triumphed in the regions between Germany and Russia, Austria-Hungary and Poland, where they continued to determine the nature of nationalism for many years. The dominance of this anxious and exclusionary mindset enabled the anti-Jewish code of hatred to continue as one of the main indications of the true super-identity. Although anti-Semitism was not always publicly demonstrated, and the ink used in the printed media and textbooks was not always spiked with venom, Judeophobia continued to insinuate itself into the crucial nodes of identity. One reason for this was that defining the national entity in those rambling, branching cultural spaces required a great many past indications of a common origin, and any element that might challenge the myth of a unifying source provoked revulsion and fear. Even nationalists who were confirmed atheists resorted to traditional religious symbols in their self-definition, while respected clergymen accepted the principle of blood as a boundary marker. In other words, just as Germanity at some stage needed abundant Aryanism to define itself, so Polishness needed Catholicism and Russianness needed Orthodox Panslavism to swaddle their national identities and imagery. Unlike the Jewish religious reform movement, or the liberal and socialist intellectual groups that sought participation in the emergent national cultures, Zionism borrowed extensively from the dominant nationalist ideologies flourishing in the lands of its birth and infancy, and integrated them into its new platform. It included traces of German Volkism, while Polish Romantic nationalist features characterized much of its rhetoric. But these were not mere imitations. It was not a case of an agonized victim taking on some features of his smiling executioner. While the secular, semi-nationalistic outlook of the Bund, the widespread leftist Jewish movement, demanded cultural autonomy for the people of Yiddishland, rather than a single independent polity for all the Jews of the world. Educated Zionists emulated the other nationalists in Europe, and assumed an ethno-religious or ethno-biological identity to conceptualize their self-definition. Seeking to build a bridge that could connect Jewish believers, mainly former believers, whose languages and secular customs were polyphonous and diverse, they were unable to build on the lively popular mores and turn them into a homogeneous, domesticated modern culture, as the Bund tried to do. To achieve their aim, the Zionists needed to erase existing ethnographic textures, forget specific histories, and take a flying leap backward to an ancient, mythological and religious past. As the previous chapters have shown, while the chosen history ostensibly matched the religious imaginary, it was not really religious, because Jewish monotheism was not grounded in historical evolutionary time. Nor was it wholly secular, since it ceaselessly utilized materials from the old eschatological faith in order to structure the new collective identity. We must remember that Jewish nationalism had undertaken an almost impossible mission, to forge a single ethnos from a great variety of cultural linguistic groups, each with a distinctive origin. This accounts for the adoption of the Old Testament, as the storehouse of national memory. In their urgent need to establish a common origin for the people, the national historians embraced uncritically the old Christian idea of the Jew as the eternal exile. In the process, they erased and forgot the mass proselytization carried out by early Judaism, thanks to which the religion of Moses grew enormously, both demographically and intellectually. For the Jewish nationalists, Judaism ceased to be a rich and varied religious culture, and turned into something hermetic, like the German Volk or the Polish and Russian Narod, though with the unique characteristic that it comprised an alien, wandering people, unrelated to the territories it inhabited. In this sense, Zionism became something of a negative reflection of the anti-Jewish image that accompanied the rise of collectivities in Eastern and Central Europe. This negative reflection correctly identified the national sensibilities in this region, and their physical proximity kept their menace in full view. Zionism's basic assumptions were correct and, as noted before, it borrowed many elements from the nationalism in which it was embedded. At the same time, it adopted the most exclusionary and conceited aspect of the Jewish religious tradition, the divine commandment that the people shall dwell alone, and shall not be reckoned among the nations. Numbers 23-9. The ancient ideal of an elect, holy, monotheistic congregation was reinterpreted in an isolationist, secular plan of action. Zionism from its inception was an ethnocentric nationalist movement that firmly enclosed the historical people of its own invention, and barred any voluntary civil entry into the nation its platform began to design. At the same time, any withdrawal from the people was depicted as an unforgivable offense, and assimilation as a catastrophe, an existential danger to be averted at all costs. No wonder, then, that to bind together the frangible secular Jewish identity, it was not enough to write a history of the Jews, so culturally disparate, so chronologically fragmentary. Zionism had to resort to another scientific discipline, that of biology, which was conscripted to reinforce the foundation of the ancient Jewish nation.